4. None of the proponents of the Constitution, including James Madison, were sure how the Constitution would actually work or if it would last, but they were infuriated to think it might not even be given a chance. And indeed, when the people read the Constitution, they put up such a howl, it seemed that they might refuse to have anything to do with it. Each state was to elect representatives to send to its own ratifying convention, and only when 9 states had voted to ratify would the Constitution go into effect. It was particularly important that the big states ratify: Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, and Virginia, but they were the ones which were raising such a clamor. The central government would have too much power, they cried. The states would be lost. Before they knew it, they'd have a king. And where was a Bill of Rights? The complaints piled up, and it was clear that they had to be met head-on and quickly. After all, the people had had no chance to catch up to the thinking of the delegates. They had to be educated. So 3 men, Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, known best for his diplomatic services abroad, joined in a monumental effort to explain the Constitution to the public and to show how impossible it was to continue under the old articles. As for the Bill of Rights, that was no problem, they pointed out. Such a bill could be added later to the Constitution as amendments. 85 essays appeared in print, 51 by Hamilton, 29 by Madison, 5 by Jay, all signed simply Publius, were published first as letters in a New York newspaper, but eventually they were bound together as a book, the Federalist Papers, which is still prized today as one of our country's masterpieces. Even the name was a clever stroke. By identifying themselves as Federalists, the authors forced the opposition to take on the name Anti-Federalist, which they resented. They were the true Federalists, the Antis insisted. Those who supported the Constitution should be called Nationalists, but like it or not, Antis they were, and they remained a strong negative force. When James Madison embarked on this writing project, he was still worn out from his work at the convention. He had an air of fatigue, one observer noted. And no wonder, he worked under great pressure, as the letters were appearing daily. He was also carrying on a wide correspondence with friends all over the country to encourage them in the struggle. In particular, he wrote to Edmund Randolph. He worded his letters carefully because he knew Randolph would only change his mind about the Constitution if he thought it was entirely his own idea. And he did, fortunately, in time to support it publicly. On March 24, 1788, Virginia was to elect representatives to its ratifying convention. Of course, Madison expected to take part in the convention. How could he take a chance that Virginia might blunder? He went home as soon as he could, but he didn't arrive until March 23rd, and then he was told that the county was running strong against the Constitution. He might not be elected if he didn't give a campaign speech. He hated the idea. It was too much like tooting his own horn, but he had to set the people straight. So the next day he gave his first campaign speech, launching into a harangue, he wrote, in the open air and on a very windy day. It would have been hard for James Madison to pit his small voice against the wind. Many of his words must have blown away, but his harangue worked. He was elected. The convention was held in June. By this time, 8 states had ratified: Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Maryland, and South Carolina accepted with little trouble. Pennsylvania agreed after a struggle, but Massachusetts argued for a month before it ratified, and then only by the narrowest margin, 187 votes to 168. If Virginia were the 9th state to ratify, the Union would be safe. If Virginia said no, New York, which was not at all enthusiastic about the Constitution, might follow suit. Then, even if 9 states did ratify, there wouldn't be much of a union with 2 of the biggest states out of it. Because of the crowds, the convention was moved to their largest room in Richmond. Even then it was packed, 170 delegates and hordes of spectators, many of them curious to see if Patrick Henry, who was against the Constitution, was really as fabulous a speaker as everyone said he was. He had not given a public speech in 12 years. He was 52 years old now and wore a wig which would have covered his baldness if he'd let it. But no, as soon as he got excited, he shoved that wig up and down, back and forth, as if it might burst into flames at any minute, if allowed to lie still. His years had not slowed Patrick Henry down one whit. As soon as he stood up, people sighed with satisfaction. Yes, he was the same old spellbinder. He pushed his glasses up on his forehead, raised one shoulder a notch, looked intensely at his audience with what people called his Patrick Flash, and before he said a word, people could sense the entire force of his contempt for the Constitution. "We the people," he snorted. Since when had they become we the people? Were they not still, first and foremost, we the states, as they had been under the good old Articles of Confederation? And what was wrong with those articles? Hadn't the people lived in perfect tranquility under them? Once Patrick Henry spoke 8 times in a single day. Once he spoke all day long, but no matter how long he spoke or how often, no one moved while he was on stage. During other speeches, the audience felt free to shift about and whisper, stretch their legs, and sometimes leave. It wasn't just what Patrick said that kept everyone so transfixed. It was the way he said it. When he talked of the new government as an empire reducing its citizens to slavery, he raised his arms in such a way that a person could almost see his chains. One member of the audience tested his own wrists to see if they too were shackled. Then there was the time when Patrick pretended to be the state of Virginia, balancing the fate of America on the scales of justice. 8 states were in favor of the Constitution, he said, wiggling those imaginary scales. But what had that to do with justice? 12.5 states voted for the Constitution, he cried. Still, he would, with manly firmness, reject it. No one enjoyed Patrick Henry's theatrics more than Patrick himself, and he had even more reason to be pleased with himself when, in the middle of a speech, one of his older sons approached the platform with a whispered message. Patrick's wife, Dorothea, had just given birth to Patrick's 12th child, a boy. There was no stopping Patrick Henry now, and no one tried. When he finally sat down, the Federalists wanted only to get rid of the emotion in the room, set the debate back on firm ground, and let reason take over. But Mr. Madison wasn't the man to do it. Not yet. Let Edmund Randolph start off for the Federalists. He was always impressive. Not until the 3rd day of the debate did James Madison take his turn. He had never faced this many people at one time, but he stood his ground, his hat in his hand, his notes in his hat. He must have expected the audience to walk out because he knew he couldn't be heard in the back of the room and probably not even seen. Sometimes his voice sank so low, not even the secretary recording the meeting could hear it. But people didn't walk out. Those in the back began to move forward, and before long, much of the audience was standing in front of him, trying to catch every word. Rocking back and forth on his feet, James Madison poured out his convictions, firmly, evenly. He talked of checks and balances, pointing out that the Senate, elected by the state legislatures, was really a confederated body, while the House, elected by the people, was more national. It was a mixed government. How could it be called an empire, as Mr. Henry had claimed? Only the House had the power to spend money and declare war, and if ever the Congress got out of hand, the president could veto its measures. And if Congress thought the president was wrong, it could override his veto. Where was the slavery in that? For 2 days, Patrick Henry and other antis attacked the Constitution while James Madison and his friends defended it. Then James Madison took sick with what he called a bilious attack and had to go to bed for 4 days. Others took over for him, and when he came back, James was wearing a brand new buff-colored coat. At least he could be more easily seen now, even if he wasn't always heard. June 26 was the day of the vote. At the last minute, Patrick Henry put forward a motion that the Constitution should not be ratified unless all amendments, including a Bill of Rights, should be accepted in advance. Of course, this was just another blocking measure. What kind of muddle would they be in, Madison asked, if every state wanted to rewrite the Constitution before it was accepted? He pointed out that the Constitution made provisions for amendments, but Mr. Henry brushed this aside. In one last dramatic stand, he brought God into the argument. Beings of a higher order, he proclaimed, were watching them this very minute, anxious for justice. Either Patrick was lucky or he had looked out the window because suddenly, as if on cue, the sky darkened. A storm hit the city, shook the building, and set doors and windows banging and rattling. James Madison waited out the noise. There was only one question that faced them, he said calmly. It had nothing to do with amendments. It was the Constitution itself. Take it or leave it. Virginia voted to take it. It was a narrow squeak. 89 votes for ratification, 79 against. Although Virginia would soon learn that New Hampshire was actually the ninth state to ratify, at the moment, Virginians believed that they were the ones starting off the Union. Still, there was no celebrating in Richmond that night. The vote had been too close. How could anyone shoot firecrackers over a city where there were so many losers? Madison went from the convention to Washington's home, Mount Vernon. All during the proceedings, he had been writing Washington, keeping him up to date, but now the two men, who had become close friends, would talk over what had happened and discuss the future. Surely Madison must have impressed upon Washington how indispensable he was to the country. Everyone was depending on him to be president and start the government off on the right track. Washington resisted. Truly, he wanted nothing more than to spend the rest of his life at his beloved Mount Vernon, but both men knew that in the end, Washington would not refuse. As the summer went on, the Union began to take shape. New York ratified in July, and although North Carolina and Rhode Island held back, they were both in the Union not too long after it had formed. Now it was time for Congress to put down on the calendar the dates when the new government would take over. January 1789, elections would be held for the presidential electors in each state. Some states would cast more votes than others for the president since the Constitution allows each state the same number of electors as it has senators and representatives. It is these electors who actually cast the vote for their states, for president and vice president. At that time, the man who received the most votes from the electors became president, while the one with the second most votes became vice president. February 2nd, members of Congress would be elected. On March 4th, the new Congress would meet in New York. On April 6th, it would count the votes for the president and vice president. Later that month, the president would be inaugurated. At first, James Madison wanted to be a Virginia senator. According to the Constitution at that time, senators were elected by their state legislatures. Who controlled Virginia's legislature? Patrick Henry, who in his usual unbridled style declared that James Madison's election would produce rivulets of blood throughout the land. Indeed, when James decided to run for the House of Representatives, Patrick Henry tried to wreck his chances there too. By deliberately combining anti-Federalist counties with Orange County in a congressional district, Mr. Henry hoped to make it impossible for Madison to win. Madison's friends wrote him in New York, where he was serving in the old, soon-to-be-replaced Congress. Come home, they said. Lies were being spread about him. He would never win unless he spoke up for himself. In other words, electioneer. Just what Madison hated above all else. But when Madison arrived home and heard what was being said, that he opposed adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution and that he no longer supported freedom of religion, he knew he had no choice. It was not his opponent in the election, James Monroe, who was spreading such stories. Though an anti-Federalist, Monroe was a close friend, and indeed they traveled together for company as they toured their district campaigning. Refraining from personal remarks, they stuck to the issues, and Madison must have done well, for he won the election by a wide margin. The worst thing that happened to him was that on a bitter cold night, his nose was frostbitten. He carried the scar for life. On April 6th, when the new Congress counted the electoral votes, it was no surprise that George Washington was elected president. John Adams of Massachusetts received the second highest number of votes and became the vice president. Americans had never inaugurated a president before, but they had always known how to put on a show, and this was time for one. On April 23rd, a specially built barge rowed by 13 men in white uniforms carried the president-elect to Battery Park in New York City. The barge was followed by a mile-long parade of rowboats and sailboats and flying flags, and it was met by explosions of fireworks, rockets shooting into the sky, cascades of stars falling over the harbor, and even a portrait of Washington shot sparkling into the air. In the procession that marched to the actual inaugural ceremony, James Madison was one of 5 representatives who walked behind Washington and stood nearby throughout the proceedings. Listening to Washington's inaugural address, he would have found no surprises. Washington had shown it to him weeks before and asked what he thought. "Too long," Madison said, and rewrote it. Later, he would write Washington's address to the House of Representatives, and then, as if he were carrying on a dialogue with himself, he would write the House's reply to Washington and Washington's reply to the House. The government was in motion, and Madison was obviously close to the helm.